At my daughter's Christmas dinner, her mother-in-law mocked the wooden gift I had made and insulted my late wife before 50 guests. When my daughter quietly defended her mother, her husband stormed across the room and slapped her. "You were told not to talk back in this house," he hissed. No one moved. No one said a word. I picked up the cracked wooden box, led my daughter to my old truck, and made one call. Begin step 1. Freeze everything. By sunrise, their accounts were locked, their projects had stopped, and the entire family was calling me in panic. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I'd love to know. Welcome to Dad Family Revenge, where every story carries a lesson worth keeping. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the message is real and it matters. The drive to the Caldwell estate took 25 minutes from Gahanna, and I had made it enough times to know every turn without thinking. December air pressed cold against the truck windows. On both sides of the road, Christmas lights blinked from rooftops and porch rails, cheerful and indifferent to whatever was about to happen inside that house. On the passenger seat sat a wooden box I had spent 3 weeks building in my shop. Walnut hand-jointed corners, a small brass latch I had polished twice before deciding it was good enough. Inside the box was the last photograph ever taken of my wife Helen and our daughter Madeline, together. 2 women laughing at something just outside the frame, the summer light catching Helen's hair the way it always did. I had framed it myself and lined the box with felt the color of sage. I was 60 years old, a widower, and to everyone at the Caldwell house tonight, I was nothing more than a furniture repairman from Gahanna who drove a 15-year-old pickup and wore flannel shirts to Christmas parties. That was exactly how I needed it to stay. For now. The Caldwell estate rose at the end of a private lane, white columns, black shutters, windows, tall enough to show the chandelier light pouring gold across the front lawn. More than 50 guests tonight if the cars in the side lot were any indication. Range Rovers, Mercedes, sedans, 1 silver Porsche, parked sideways across 2 spaces, with the casual arrogance of someone who had never once worried about a parking ticket. I pulled the truck into the far corner of the lot and sat for a moment with the engine idling. A household staff member young man, white dress shirt, black vest, held the front door open as I approached. He nodded at me with the kind of professional warmth that treated all guests equally, regardless of what they were wearing. I appreciated that more than he would ever know. Then I saw Madeline. She was standing near the base of the staircase in a deep blue dress, her dark hair pinned up, and my heart clenched the moment I saw her face. My daughter was beautiful, but tonight her cheeks were pale and her eyes carried something tight and hunted that she was working very hard to hide from the room. The moment she spotted me, she crossed the floor quickly and wrapped both arms around me, pressing her face briefly against my shoulder. "Dad?" Her voice was barely above a breath. "Don't ask anything tonight. Please, just be normal, okay? Just be Dad." I held her for a moment and felt how rigid she was, every muscle braced like she was expecting something to hit her. "Hey," I said quietly. "I'm just Dad. That's all." She pulled back and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned just slightly to look across the room. I followed her gaze and found Ryan standing near the fireplace with a bourbon in his hand, laughing at something relaxed and easy, the picture of a man without a single thing on his mind. Then for just a fraction of a second, Ryan's eyes moved not to me, but past me to his left. Victoria Caldwell stood 10 feet away, watching her son with an expression so brief and deliberate, it would have meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 30 years reading wood grain for hidden stress fractures. It meant something to me. Victoria turned and extended one hand. "Walter, so glad you could make it." Her grip was brief and boneless. Across the room, Richard caught my eye and moved toward me with his campaign-stop handshake already extended. Arthur Big Night. He had called me Arthur for 3 years. I had never corrected him. I looked back at Madeline. She was watching Ryan again, her fingers pressed flat against the skirt of her dress, her jaw working slightly like she was reminding herself to keep breathing. I had seen that look before. Not on my daughter, on people who were frightened and doing everything they could not to show it. Something was going to break tonight. I just didn't know yet which direction it would fall. The dining room held 4 round tables set for 10, each one dressed in white linen, with centerpieces of pine branches and white candles that cast a warm, flattering light over everything. The crystal, the silverware, the faces of people who had learned long ago how to look comfortable in expensive rooms. I found my seat near the end of the second table beside a woman named Patricia, who introduced herself as Victoria's cousin from Cleveland. She had kind eyes and a slightly apologetic way of smiling, like she was perpetually embarrassed by something the rest of her family had done. I liked her immediately. Madeline was seated 3 chairs away, close enough that I could watch her without appearing to. Ryan sat at the far end of the table from his wife, which struck me as a choice rather than an accident. He was already on his second bourbon, laughing with the man beside him, gesturing broadly with his glass. The wooden box sat on the table in front of Madeline's empty seat. She hadn't brought it in herself. One of the staff had carried it from the entrance hall and placed it there. And now it sat among the pine branches and candles like something that had wandered into the wrong party. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, and the room settled into the particular attentiveness that hostesses like her command without asking. She lifted her wine glass, smiled at the assembled guests, and then her eyes moved to the wooden box. "Walter," her voice carried easily across the table, "you brought us something handmade again this year." Several heads turned. I set down my water glass and met her gaze without hurrying. "It's for Madeline," I said, "not for the table." Victoria reached across and drew the box toward her, with 2 fingers, the way you might handle something you expected to be dusty. She unlatched it, looked at the photograph inside, and her expression did something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite pity, but landed somewhere between the two. "A wooden box and an old photograph," she said, loud enough for the nearest 2 tables to hear. "How wonderfully sentimental." She set it back down and looked around the table. "We give each other Rolex watches and company shares in this family, but I suppose everyone expresses affection in the way they're capable of." A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. Patricia beside me pressed her lips together and found something very interesting to study in her bread plate. My jaw tightened, but I kept my face easy and my hands flat on the tablecloth. Madeline reached out and pulled the box to her side of the table. Her chin was up and her voice was steady when she said, "I love it, Dad. I've been wanting something like this for a long time." Victoria tilted her head. "Sweetheart, you don't have to pretend. It's a lovely gesture, truly." Her tone was the kind that wraps a blade in velvet. "Though I do think it's time you started developing a taste for finer things. You've been a Caldwell for 3 years now." The color in Madeline's face shifted, a slight draining like water leaving a glass. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ryan spoke first from the far end of the table. "Mom." Just the one word, flat and quick, and I watched Madeline's shoulders drop half an inch at the sound of it, not from relief, but from something that looked closer to submission. She closed her mouth. I cut a piece of bread and said nothing, and stored everything I had just seen in the part of my mind where I keep things I intend to examine more carefully later. Richard seized the moment to redirect the table's attention, which he was very good at. He launched into a description of a new hotel development his company was backing near downtown Columbus, premium location, 8 stories, rooftop bar, the whole vision. His voice swelled with the pride of a man describing his own genius. The capital structure on this one is something special, he said, swirling his wine. We've got a private fund backing the senior debt position. Real patient money, the kind that understands long-term value creation. I lifted my water glass and said mildly, "What's the loan-to-value ratio on the senior tranche?" Richard blinked. For just a moment he looked at me the way people look at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly spoken. 60%, he said, recovering smoothly. Conservative. That's how we structure everything. Clean and conservative. Smart, I said, and drank my water. Richard smiled and moved on, already turning toward the man on his other side, satisfied. He had no way of knowing that I had reviewed that exact project 3 months ago, that I had read every page of the financial model, flagged 2 optimistic revenue assumptions, and placed the entire approval on hold, pending a revised operating cost analysis. I was the patient money he was bragging about. He was bragging to me about my own decision not to fund him yet. Patricia leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "I never understand half of what Richard says at these dinners." She smiled her apologetic smile. "Is it interesting, the finance side of things?" "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly, it's just math." She laughed softly at that, a real laugh, and I found myself grateful for it, in a room where most of the sounds people made required an audience. Across the table, Victoria raised her glass and looked at Madeline with an expression that had sharpened since the bread course. "My daughter-in-law should feel grateful," she said, with the conversational ease of someone dropping a stone into water just to watch the rings. "Without this family, she'd still be the daughter of a furniture repairman. And there's no shame in that, of course." She glanced at me with a small, bright smile. "Every society needs people who work with their hands." Madeline's hand moved under the table. I saw her grip the edge of her chair, her knuckles going white, and something in my chest pulled so tight it felt like a wire drawn to snapping. But she didn't speak. She pressed her lips together and stared at her plate and said absolutely nothing, and I understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had been taught in this house that speaking was more dangerous than swallowing it. Ryan looked at his wife from the far end of the table. He didn't say a word in her defense. Not one word. I picked up my fork, cut a piece of the roasted tenderloin on my plate, and chewed it slowly. Beside me, Patricia was very quiet now. Across the table, 2 other guests had developed a sudden fascination with their wine glasses. I thought about a phone number I had memorized 11 years ago and never once used in anger. That was about to change. It started with something small. That was how it always started with Victoria Caldwell. She never needed volume. She had spent decades perfecting the art of the quiet wound, the comment delivered in a dinner party voice that left a bruise no one could point to afterward. What happened that evening began the same way, with something so casually cruel that half the table probably missed it entirely. Madeline had reached for the wooden box and placed it gently on her lap, away from Victoria's reach. It was a small act, protective, the kind of thing a person does when they are trying to hold on to the one thing in the room that still feels safe. Victoria watched her do it. "You know," Victoria said, her voice bright and carrying, "I've always admired people who are sentimental. It takes a certain kind of person to find meaning in simple things." She paused just long enough to make the next sentence land cleanly. "Of course, it also takes a certain kind of upbringing." The table went careful. Madeline looked up from the box. Her dark eyes were steady, but I could see the color rising along her jaw and the small, rapid movement of her throat as she swallowed once, twice before she spoke. "The box belonged to my mother," Madeline said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, I think, but it came out. "Dad made it to hold the last photograph we have of her. I think that's worth more than a watch." The words were gentle. There was no aggression in them. She was simply telling the truth, the way her mother had always told the truth directly without decoration, because Helen Hayes had believed that honesty was its own form of dignity. Victoria set her fork down with a small, precise click. "Your mother." She repeated the words with a tilt of her head as though she were examining them from a new angle. "Of course. And I'm sure she was a lovely woman. But darling, you've been part of this family for 3 years now. At some point, the past has to stay in the past, especially at the dinner table." Madeline's chin came up. "I wasn't bringing up the past," she said. "I was explaining why the gift matters to me. And I'm explaining—" Victoria said, her voice dropping to something that carried further than a shout, "that this table is not the appropriate place for grief performances. We have guests." The room held its breath. I watched Ryan from across the table. He was already setting his bourbon glass down, already straightening in his chair. And before he stood just before in the half-second between decision and action, his eyes moved to his mother. It was the same look I had seen in the entrance hall. Quick, deliberate. A signal passing between two people who had done this before. My chest went cold. Ryan stood up. The room expected him to speak, to redirect, to do the one thing a husband is supposed to do when his wife is being diminished in public. Every person at that table was waiting for it, leaning toward it without realizing. Instead, he crossed around the corner of the table in 3 strides, and before anyone understood what was happening, his open hand came across and struck Madeline across the face. The sound cut through the room like something breaking that could not be repaired. Madeline's head snapped to the side. The wooden box fell from her lap and hit the floor. Her hand flew up to her cheek, and she made a sound, not a scream, not a word, just a raw, broken exhale, the sound of a person whose body has just confirmed what their heart had feared for a long time. 50 people stopped breathing. Ryan straightened his jacket. His voice was flat and certain. "You were told how to behave tonight." Victoria picked up her wineglass. I was already on my feet. My chair scraped back, and I was moving before the thought had fully formed, walking the length of that table with my hands at my sides and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab Ryan Caldwell by the collar and drag him out of that room by force. I did not do that, because that was what they expected. That was the version of this evening where Walter Hayes, furniture repairman, made a scene at a Christmas party and was escorted out by security while the Caldwells composed themselves and explained to their guests that the situation had been handled. I reached Madeline. I put one hand on her shoulder. She flinched at the touch before she realized it was me, and that flinch told me everything I needed to know about how many times she had been afraid in this house. "Madeline." My voice came out low and even. I was proud of that. "Let's go." She looked up at me with her hand still pressed against her cheek, her eyes filling not with tears but with the stunned animal shock of someone who has just been struck in a place they believed was safe. Her lip was trembling. She was fighting it with everything she had. "Dad, we're going." I bent and picked up the wooden box from the floor and placed it in her hands. "Right now. Don't look at anyone." She stood. Her legs were unsteady, and she gripped my arm with both hands as we turned toward the entrance hall. Behind us, I heard Victoria say something to the table in a voice deliberately pitched to carry something about disruptions and poor breeding, and I felt Madeline tighten her grip on my arm until her fingers were shaking. "Don't," I said quietly. "She wants you to look back. Don't give it to her." We walked through the entrance hall and out the front door and down the gravel drive in the cold December air. The door closed behind us, and the sounds of the party were swallowed by the night. At the truck, I opened the passenger door and helped Madeline inside. She sat with both hands pressed flat against her thighs, staring through the windshield, her breath coming in short, uneven pulls. The mark on her cheek was already darkening, a deep flush spreading from her cheekbone toward her jaw. I closed the door. I walked around to the driver's side and stood for a moment in the dark beside the truck, with the cold settling into my collar and the gravel quiet under my boots. My hands were shaking now that she couldn't see them. I pressed them flat against the cold metal of the truck roof and held them there until they stopped. Then I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. The phone rang twice before Samuel picked up. "Mr. Hayes." His voice was the same as it always was, measured, unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where the wrong word cost millions. Samuel Grant had been my attorney for 11 years, the sole person outside of 2CP. Hayes, who knew that Walter Hayes, furniture repairman of Gahanna, Ohio, was the founding principal and only beneficiary of Northbridge Holdings, a private investment trust with significant positions in commercial real estate, hotel development, and structured credit facilities across central Ohio. "Samuel," I said, "begin step 1. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "Understood. I'll need until morning for the full credit acceleration. The audit referral I can initiate within the hour." "The hour is fine. Are you all right, sir?" I looked through the passenger window at Madeline. She was sitting with both hands pressed flat against her thighs, staring at the dashboard, her jaw working like she was trying to hold her face together through sheer willpower. The mark on her cheek had deepened to a dark flush that I could see even in the dim light of the parking lot. "No," I said, "but I will be. I'll confirm when step 1 is complete." I ended the call and stood in the cold for a moment longer. Let me explain what step 1 meant, because it was not complicated, though it would feel that way to the people receiving it. Northbridge Holdings controlled through a series of intermediary funds the senior debt position on 3 of Caldwell Development's largest active projects. As senior lender, Northbridge had specific rights written into every credit agreement from the beginning, rights that Richard Caldwell's attorneys had reviewed and signed without imagining they would ever be exercised. Those rights included the authority to trigger an independent audit clause, which had the immediate practical effect of freezing all existing credit lines until the audit was resolved. No new draws, no extensions, no flexibility. None of this was illegal. None of it was even unusual. It was simply the application of a contract that had always existed by a man that Richard Caldwell had never bothered to look at directly. I got into the truck. Madeline turned to me the moment I closed the door, her eyes red at the edges, but dry. She had made a decision not to cry and was enforcing it with everything she had. "Who did you call?" she asked. "My attorney." She blinked. "Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since before you were born." She stared at me. "Dad, what's going on?" I started the engine. The heater came on and pushed cold air for a moment before it began to warm. I pulled out of the lot and onto the dark road heading south, and I chose my words the way I chose wood for a difficult joint carefully, because the wrong piece would split under pressure. "I've been watching the Caldwell Company financials for 3 months, I said. "The numbers they've been reporting don't match what I've been seeing on the ground." I asked Samuel to look into it quietly. I was waiting for the full picture before I did anything. I kept my eyes on the road. Tonight gave me the only reason I needed to stop waiting. Madeline's breath caught. "What does that mean? What are you going to do?" "What I should have done a long time ago." I glanced at her. "But first, I'm taking you home." She pressed her fingers against her cheek, gently testing the tenderness, and winced. Her lip trembled once before she pressed it flat. "He's never done it in front of people before," she said very quietly. "He's always been careful about that." The words landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. always been careful about that. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes forward, and I did not say what I was thinking, because what I was thinking would not help her tonight. Instead, I reached over and put my hand over hers just for a moment and felt how cold her fingers were. My phone buzzed on the seat between us. A text from Samuel. 3 words. Step 1 complete. I left it face down and kept driving. Somewhere behind us, in a house full of crystal and candlelight, someone's phone was about to ring with news they were not prepared to receive. The kitchen light was the first thing I turned on when we got inside. It was the kind of light that made everything look honest yellow and close and a little too bright for secrets. Madeline sat down at the table without being asked, still in her blue dress, still with her coat half on her shoulders, and pressed both palms flat against the tabletop, like she needed to feel something solid underneath her. I filled a dish towel with ice from the freezer and set it in front of her without a word. She pressed it against her cheek and closed her eyes for a moment, and the small sound she made, barely a breath, barely audible, hit me somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. I sat down across from her and waited. She started talking. It came out the way things do when they have been held in too long, not in a flood, but in pieces. Each one dropped carefully, like she was still deciding in real time how much she could afford to let go. He has documents, she said. Papers with your signature on them. Loan guarantees, he calls them. He says you agreed to personally back several of the company's credit lines. She kept her eyes on the ice pack. He says if I leave or if I tell anyone what's been happening, he'll file them with the bank and the IRS. He says they'll come after the house, the shop. Her voice thinned. He told me you'd lose everything and wouldn't be able to afford a lawyer to fight it. My hands were very still on the table. I never signed anything for the Caldwell company, I said. I know. She finally looked up at me, and the pain in her eyes was the kind that comes not from surprise, but from having known something terrible for a long time and having carried it completely alone. I know you didn't. The signatures are fake. But Dad, I've seen the documents. They look real. And Ryan said it wouldn't matter if they were fake because by the time anyone proved it, you'd already be destroyed. I held her gaze and kept my voice level. How long has this been going on? She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. Since about 8 months after the wedding. 3 years. She had been living inside this for almost 3 years. Every time I called to ask for money, she said. And now her voice broke on the last word, cracked right down the middle, and she pulled in a sharp breath through her nose and pushed forward anyway. Every single time Ryan was standing right next to me. He wrote down what I needed to say. The amounts, the reasons. A tear broke free and tracked down the side of her face that wasn't bruised, and she swiped at it with the back of her hand like it had no right to be there. I knew it was wrong. I knew every time. But he said if I didn't do it, he'd make the call that night. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out my old phone, the one I kept for personal messages separate from the one I used for Northbridge. I opened the voicemail folder and found the messages from 8 months ago. Madeline's number. 6 of them spread across 4 weeks. I pressed play on the first one. Her voice came out of the small speaker, and I heard it the way I should have heard it the first time. Not the words, not the amounts she was asking for, but the texture underneath. The half-second pause before she said my name. The small, controlled breath before each number. The way her sentences ended just slightly too quickly, clipped at the edges like she was reading from something, and trying not to sound like she was reading from something. I had heard those messages 8 months ago, and I had thought my daughter sounded tired. She had been terrified. I set the phone down on the table. My jaw ached from how hard I was holding it. Dad. Madeline reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were still ice cold from the drive home, and they were shaking a fine, constant trembling, she probably wasn't even aware of anymore. "Please say something. I'm going to need you to tell me everything," I said. "All of it. From the beginning." She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, and she talked, and I listened. And the kitchen clock above the stove moved its hands around once and kept going. And outside, the December night pressed cold against the windows of the house where my daughter had grown up, believing she was safe. A knock at the front door broke the quiet just after 11. I opened it to find Peggy Okafor standing on the porch in her winter coat, holding a pot covered with a dish towel. Peggy had lived 3 houses down for 19 years. She had brought food to this door when Helen died, and she had never once required an explanation for anything. "Saw your lights," she said, looking at my face with the calm, reading expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize its harder nights. "Chicken soup. Don't argue." "I wasn't going to," I said. She handed me the pot and squeezed my forearm once with her free hand and walked back down the porch steps without another word. I stood in the doorway for a moment, with the warm pot between my hands and the cold night air on my face, and felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly, the particular relief of being known by someone even a little, even just enough. I closed the door and carried the soup to the kitchen. Madeline looked up when I came back in. Her eyes were swollen now, both of them, and her makeup had given up entirely, and she looked younger than 28 and older at the same time. "Who was that?" she asked. "A neighbor," I said. "One of the good ones." I set the pot on the stove and turned the burner on low, and Madeline's phone began to ring on the table between us. Ryan's name lit up the screen. We both looked at it. "Don't," I said. She reached out and turned it face down, and the ringing went on for a while, and then stopped, and we sat together in the warm kitchen, with the soup beginning to heat on the stove, and the ice pack melting slowly on the table, and everything that had just been said still hanging in the air between us, too large and too true to put anywhere yet. That night, sitting in my kitchen, listening to everything my daughter had been carrying alone, I made a decision. Before I tell you what I did next, drop "Dad" in the comments, so I know you're still here. Note the next part of this story includes some fictional elements built for reflection and education. If this kind of storytelling isn't for you, it's perfectly fine to step away right here. By 3 in the morning, Ryan had called 41 times. I knew because I had been sitting at the kitchen table watching the phone light up in the dark, counting without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind needs something simple to hold on to. The soup pot was on the counter, half empty. The kitchen light was off. I had turned it off an hour ago when Madeline finally went upstairs, and now the only light in the room came from the occasional flare of Ryan's name on the screen. I did not answer. Victoria sent 3 text messages between midnight and 2. The first said that Madeline needed to come home and that this was not a matter for discussion. The second said that Richard's attorneys would be making calls in the morning. The third said simply, "You have no idea what you've started." I read all 3 and set the phone face down on the table. Richard sent one message at 1:47 in the morning. It said, "Let's be reasonable about this, Walter. We're all adults." I did not read that one twice. At 5:30, I heard the furnace kick on in the basement and the old house creak once around the joints, the way it did in deep cold, and I understood that I had been sitting at that table for over 4 hours and had not moved and was not going to sleep. I wrote a note on the back of an envelope. Gone for an hour. Coffee in the pot, and left it on the counter where Madeline would see it. The drive to Granville took 40 minutes in the dark. Snow had fallen sometime after midnight, not much, just enough to cover the roads in a thin white that caught my headlights and made the familiar route look like somewhere I had never been. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and let the quiet of it work on me the way quiet sometimes can when you stop fighting it. St. Andrew's was a small, white-clapboard church on the edge of Granville's historic district, the kind of church that had been there long enough that the town had simply grown up around it. Helen and I had driven out here every Sunday for 11 years, 40 minutes each way, because she said the building had good bones, and the congregation didn't perform. After she died, I had kept coming for 2 more years, and then stopped, though I was never entirely sure why. Some mornings I thought it was because the pew where she used to sit still held the shape of her in some way I couldn't explain and couldn't bear. The lights were already on inside when I pulled into the small gravel lot. Pastor Glenn Whitaker was 67 years old, built like a man who had spent his youth doing physical work and his middle age doing harder work of a different kind. He had officiated Helen's funeral and had said exactly the right things, and had never once in the years since asked me why I stopped coming. When he opened the side door and saw me standing in the pre-dawn cold with snow on my shoulders, and what I suspected was a fairly obvious expression on my face, he simply stepped back and said, "Come in, I'll put on coffee." The inside of the church was warm and smelled of old wood and candle wax. We sat in the front pew, not the one where Helen and I used to sit, and Pastor Whitaker handed me a mug and folded his hands around his own and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that most people would get to the point eventually if you gave them enough room. "She's been alone in that house for 3 years," I said, "and I didn't know." My voice came out rougher than I intended. I pressed my mouth shut and looked up at the wooden cross above the altar and felt something in my throat that I had not allowed myself to feel since the parking lot of the Caldwell estate, when I had pressed my shaking hands against the cold metal of my truck roof and waited for them to stop. They had stopped then because I needed them to. They were shaking again now around the coffee mug, and I let them. "She was protecting me," I said. "My 28-year-old daughter was protecting me. She thought I was a retired carpenter with a savings account and a shop full of tools, and she spent 3 years absorbing everything that family threw at her, because she was afraid of what they would do to me." I exhaled hard through my nose. I built an entire structure to protect her, and she spent 3 years protecting it right back, and neither of us was protecting the right thing. Pastor Whitaker didn't offer me a scripture. He didn't tell me it wasn't my fault. He just sat there in the warm quiet of the church and let me say the thing out loud, which was the only thing that needed doing. "Helen would have known," I said, and my voice broke on the last word, cracked clean through, and I didn't try to recover it. I just let it sit there broken in the warm air of that old church. She always knew. The moment she met Ryan, she would have seen it. She would have taken me aside at the first dinner and said, "Walter, that young man smiles with his mouth, and his eyes do something else entirely," and I would have paid attention, because I always paid attention when Helen said something was wrong. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. "I miss her every single day," I said, "but I missed her the most tonight." Pastor Whitaker put his hand on my shoulder. He left it there for a long moment without speaking, and outside the church windows, the sky was beginning to shift from black to the deep gray that comes just before dawn in December, and somewhere in the town a dog barked twice and went quiet. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I set my coffee mug down on the pew beside me and straightened my coat and felt the grief settle back into the place where I kept it, not gone, never gone, just carried differently. "What needs to be done?" I said. I stood up and he walked me to the door, and we shook hands, the way men do when words have already done everything words can do. Outside, the snow had stopped. The gravel lot was white and still, and my truck sat in it like the only solid thing for miles. I was almost at the driver's door when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Daniel Crow. My head of risk control at Northbridge, former IRS criminal investigation special agent, the most thorough man I had ever employed. His message was 4 words. I have something. Tonight. Madeline was already awake when I got back. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the oversized sweatshirt she had been wearing around the house since college. Both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her hair pulled back, the bruise on her cheek deepened overnight to the color of a storm cloud. When she heard me come through the door, she looked up with the expression of someone who had spent the last hour preparing themselves for whatever came next. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Granville. Old church your mother and I used to attend." I hung up my coat. "How's your face?" She touched her cheek carefully. "Tender. I've had worse." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, and the casualness of it hit me harder than tears would have. I poured myself a coffee and sat down across from her. "Vanessa Blake," I said. "Tell me about her." Madeline's expression shifted. "My best friend since sophomore year. She was my maid of honor." A pause. "Why?" "Because Daniel Crow sent me a message at 6 this morning saying he has something, and the only people who knew the details of what Ryan was planning were people inside that house." I watched my daughter's face. "Vanessa called you recently, more than once." Madeline set her mug down slowly. "She called yesterday, before the party. She said she was worried about me, that Ryan seemed tense." Her eyes changed as she was speaking, something moving behind them, pieces rearranging. "She asked if you were planning to make any trouble at the dinner." "What exactly did she ask?" Madeline repeated it word for word. When she finished, we looked at each other and she said very quietly, "Call her back, right now. I want to hear what she says." I nodded. She dialed, put the phone on speaker, and set it on the table between us. Vanessa answered on the second ring, her voice pitched high with performed concern. "Maddie, oh, thank God. Are you okay? I heard what happened and I've been sick with worry all night." "I'm fine," Madeline said. "Vanessa, how did you know about the paperwork, the loan documents Ryan wanted my father to sign?" Dead air. 3 full seconds of it, which is a very long time when you are waiting. "Ryan mentioned something once," Vanessa said, "when he'd been drinking. I didn't really understand what he meant. He mentioned the specific documents, the guarantees. Maddie, I just want to help you figure out the best way through this." "Vanessa." Madeline's voice had gone completely flat, stripped of every layer of warmth. "How do you know about the guarantees?" The line went dead. Madeline stared at the phone for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes dry and very bright. Then she picked up her mug and drank from it like she needed something to with her hands. "She knew," she said. "Yes. She's been telling him things. That's what Daniel is coming to show us." Daniel Crow arrived at 4 that afternoon, tall, methodical, carrying a laptop bag, and the particular air of a man who had spent 15 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and had learned to let facts do the work that emotions wasted time on. He sat up at the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and did not waste words on preamble. "The apartment first," he said, turning the screen toward us. "Security camera footage from a condominium building on the west side of Columbus. Time stamped across 14 months. Ryan Caldwell entering and leaving with a woman who was not Madeline." Madeline leaned forward, and her breath left her in a single sharp exhale like something had struck her in the chest. 14 months, Daniel said. "The unit is leased under a shell company. Payments trace back to Caldwell Development operating accounts." He moved to the next screen. "But this is the part that becomes a federal matter." He pulled up a series of photographs, pages of handwritten letters, Christmas cards, a utility bill, all with Walter Hayes written at the bottom in my own hand. Every time Vanessa visited your home, Daniel said, looking at Madeline, she photographed personal correspondence belonging to your father. Letters, cards, anything with his signature. Those samples were used to generate a digital forgery on 3 financial guarantee documents. He looked at me. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 513, forging a signature on a financial instrument is a federal felony. The documents were transmitted electronically across state lines, which adds wire fraud, Section 1343. 20 years per count. This is no longer a family dispute. This is an FBI matter. Madeline was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, her knuckles white, her face the color of the snow outside. She came to my baby shower, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She sat in my living room and held my hand when I was scared, and the whole time she stopped, pressed her fist against her mouth. Her shoulders shook once hard before she pulled them back and straightened. How long has Ryan known about this, about my father, about Northbridge? Daniel looked at me. He doesn't, I said. Not yet. She turned to look at me, and in her eyes I could see the question forming the real one, the one underneath all the others. Then what does he think he's threatening? She asked. A carpenter, I said, with a savings account and a shop full of tools. Something shifted in her expression, then grief giving way to something harder and more purposeful, the way a storm sky sometimes clears not to sunshine, but to a clean, cold certainty. Show me everything, she said to Daniel. Daniel did not rush. That was the thing about men who had spent 15 years in federal financial investigation. They understood that the damage was not in the revelation, but in the comprehension, and that comprehension took time. He moved through the files methodically, one screen at a time, and let each piece land before he moved to the next. Caldwell Development's reported asset value across their active portfolio is approximately $94 million, he said, pulling up a spreadsheet that filled the laptop screen with columns of figures. The actual recoverable value based on independent appraisals we commissioned through Northbridge's due diligence process is closer to $51 million. The gap represents a combination of inflated projections, properties carried at acquisition cost, despite significant deterioration, and in 3 cases, assets that have been pledged as collateral to multiple lenders simultaneously. Madeline looked at the numbers without speaking. Her coffee had gone cold in front of her. That's bank fraud, I said. Multiple counts. Title 18, Section 1344. Up to 30 years per count. Daniel moved to the next file. Additionally, Richard Caldwell's personal tax filings for the past 6 years show income substantially below what the company's internal disbursement records indicate he received. The difference is being routed through a series of vendor payments to entities that our investigators have been unable to locate as operating businesses. Ghost companies, Madeline said quietly. That's the working assumption. Title 26, Section 7201. Federal tax evasion. 5 years per count, and there are potentially 6 counts. He paused. The company needs $22 million within 90 days to avoid defaulting on 3 simultaneous credit obligations. That is why they needed your father's personal guarantee. A guarantee from Walter Hayes' individual would have allowed them to restructure the debt and buy approximately 18 months before the underlying problems became impossible to conceal. Madeline pressed 2 fingers against her temple. They were going to use Dad's house, his shop, his personal assets as collateral, yes. If the company subsequently defaulted, which given the trajectory of the financials, was likely those assets would have been seized to satisfy the debt. She pushed back from the table slightly and stared at the ceiling for a moment, her jaw working, her eyes bright with a particular kind of fury that was all the more dangerous for being completely controlled. What about Ryan specifically? She asked. Beyond the forgery. Daniel opened a third file. Ryan Caldwell has transferred approximately $1,200,000 from company operating accounts over the past 22 months. The funds went to 3 destinations: an online gambling platform registered in Antigua, 2 cryptocurrency exchanges, and a series of payments to the shell company that holds the lease on Vanessa Blake's apartment. He said it with the same tone he had used for every other number, because to Daniel Crow, a fact was a fact, regardless of how it felt. The gambling losses alone account for roughly $600,000. Madeline made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, a short, compressed exhalation that carried 3 years of marriage in it. "He told me we were careful with money," she said. "He said we had to be careful because the company was going through a difficult period and we all had to make sacrifices." Her voice had taken on a thin, dangerous edge. "I stopped buying new clothes. I packed my own lunch every day for 2 years. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and he meant it, which was unusual enough for him that it landed. He reached for the laptop and hesitated. "There's one more thing. I debated whether to include it, but..." He looked at me briefly, then at Madeline. "You should see it." He opened a smaller file, a single page, a billing statement from a law firm in Columbus, Hendricks and Moore Family Law Division. Date at the top, June 14th. Client name, Ryan T. Caldwell. Services rendered: initial consultation, dissolution of marriage proceedings. Madeline leaned forward. June 14th was 11 days before their second wedding anniversary. She had planned a dinner. She had bought him a watch, nothing extravagant, just something she had saved for over 4 months, because she wanted to give him something real. She stared at the billing statement for a long time, without speaking. And I watched her face do the work that faces do when the mind is processing something it already suspected but had not yet been forced to confirm. Her chin trembled once. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together so hard the color left them entirely. "He was planning to leave me," she said. "Before any of this. Before the forgery. Before the threats." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He married me, and then 6 months later he started planning how to get out." "The evidence suggests the marriage was a mechanism," Daniel said carefully. "A means of maintaining access to my father," Madeline said. She looked at me, and the tears that had been threatening finally broke free, not a flood, just 2 lines tracking quietly down her face, which somehow made it worse. "He never wanted me. He wanted a way to reach you." I reached across the table and covered both her hands with mine. They were shaking badly now, fine and continuous, and she gripped my fingers hard enough that I felt it all the way up my arm. "Listen to me," I said. "Whatever he wanted when he married you, he made a serious mistake in how he went about trying to get it." She looked at me through the tears, waiting. "He threatened a carpenter," I said. "He should have done considerably more research." She stared at me for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not a smile, not yet, but the ghost of one, the first suggestion that something other than pain was still available to her. She squeezed my hands once and let go. "When do we go see them?" she asked. "Before I reveal what happened when we walked back into that house, and what the Caldwell family discovered about the man they had spent years looking down at, drop the number 9 in the comments, so I know you're still here with me." Every comment means the world. One more thing: what follows contains some fictional elements shaped for reflection and storytelling. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, feel free to step away. But if you're staying, I promise it's worth it. We left the next morning at 9. Madeline came downstairs in dark jeans and a gray sweater. Her hair down, no jewelry, the bruise on her cheek yellowing at the edges, but still visible enough that anyone who looked at her would know immediately what it was and how it had gotten there. She had made herself coffee and was drinking it standing at the counter when I came in from the shop, and she looked at me over the rim of the mug with an expression I recognized calm on the surface. Everything underneath pulled tight and ready. "Samuel confirmed," she asked. "20 minutes ago." I poured my own coffee. "Everything is in place." She nodded. She set the mug in the sink and picked up her coat from the back of the chair and put it on with the deliberate movements of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is no longer spending energy on the question of whether to do it. I had spoken to Samuel at 7 that morning. He had been awake since 5. I could tell by the crispness in his voice the particular alertness of a man who had been preparing. He confirmed that the previous evening he had contacted Agent Carol Simmons at the FBI's Columbus field office, a contact of Daniel's from his years in federal service, and had transmitted the complete documentation package, the forgery analysis, the wire fraud evidence, the financial investigation findings. Agent Simmons had reviewed the materials and presented them to a federal magistrate judge at 8 o'clock the previous evening. The arrest warrant for Ryan Caldwell had been signed at 8:47. Agent Simmons and her partner would be outside the Caldwell estate this morning. Not visible, just present, waiting for the signal. I told Madeline this on the way to the truck, and she absorbed it the way she had been absorbing difficult information for the past 2 days, without flinching, processing it quickly, and filing it somewhere useful. "He's going to think he still has control of the room," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. "Yes." "Good." She pulled the door shut. "Let him." We pulled out of the driveway and onto the street, and the December morning opened up gray and cold around us. The kind of Ohio winter day that offers no softness anywhere, bare trees, flat sky, frost on the fields along Route 16 that caught the weak sunlight and threw it back without warmth. We drove for a while without talking, and it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that had not existed between us 4 days ago. 4 days ago, the quiet between us had been full of things unsaid. This one was different. This one was just 2 people riding in a truck who had already said the important things and didn't need to fill the space. Then Madeline said, "Tell me about Northbridge, the real version." I looked at the road ahead and thought about how to begin, and then decided the beginning was not the right place to start. "Your mother said something to me," I said, "a few months before she died. We were sitting on the back porch in the evening, late summer, and she had a mug of tea she wasn't really drinking, and she looked at me and said, 'Walter, when Madeline finds someone, don't let money be the reason.'" Madeline turned toward me on the seat. She said if you knew what I had built, it would change the way people approached you. Not necessarily in ways you could see, just subtly. The way a room changes when someone walks in who is known to be wealthy. She said she wanted you to be chosen for who you are, not for what surrounds you. So you hid it. I built a version of myself that was accurate in every way that mattered and incomplete in one specific way. The wood shop is real. The truck is real. Everything I ever told you about who I am is true. I paused. I just left out the part about the holdings. Madeline was quiet for a moment. Outside, a hawk was sitting on a fence post along the road, absolutely still, watching something in the field below, with the focused patience of a creature that understood how to wait. "She was right," Madeline said finally. "About the money. If I had known—" She stopped, started again. "I think Ryan would have been different with me from the beginning. More careful. More performance." She looked out the windshield. "I wouldn't have seen what he actually was until it was too late to matter. That was what your mother understood. But you held on to it past the point where it was protecting me." "Yes," I said. "I did. That part was my mistake, not hers." She didn't argue with that, which was its own kind of grace. We came off the highway and onto the familiar roads of Dublin, the bare oaks closing in on either side, and the Caldwell estate appeared at the end of the private lane exactly as it always had. White columns, black shutters, the suggestion of solidity that expensive architecture provides to people who have confused appearance with foundation. "You sure about this?" Madeline asked. I turned into the lane and felt the gravel under the tires. The same gravel I had walked across 4 nights ago in the cold, with my daughter shaking beside me. "I've been sure," I said, since the moment he raised his hand. She reached over and put her hand briefly on my arm, just a touch, just a second, and then she straightened in the seat and faced forward, and I could see in her profile the particular set of her jaw that she had inherited directly from her mother, the expression Helen Hayes had worn every time she walked into a room where someone had underestimated her. I parked the truck. We got out together. The front door of the Caldwell house opened before we reached it, and a staff member held it wide, and through the entrance hall, I could already see Richard and Victoria and Ryan seated in the living room, waiting arranged with the confidence of people who believed they controlled the terms of what was about to happen. Ryan looked at me across the entrance hall. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent 3 years looking at a carpenter and seeing nothing worth worrying about. I smiled back and kept walking. The living room of the Caldwell estate looked different in morning light. The chandelier was off, the candles were gone, and without the flattering warmth of Christmas evening, the room showed its true nature, expensive, carefully curated, and fundamentally cold. Richard sat in the wing-back chair nearest the fireplace with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who had called this meeting and intended to run it. Victoria occupied the sofa to his left back, straight chin level, dressed as though she had an appointment afterward that mattered more than this one. Ryan stood near the window with his arms crossed and a bourbon already in his hand at 9:15 in the morning, which told me everything I needed to know about how the last 2 days had gone for him. Vanessa sat beside Ryan close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. She was not looking at Madeline. Madeline walked into that room and took the chair across from Richard without hesitating, without glancing at Vanessa, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her find her footing. She sat down and crossed her ankles and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her father-in-law with the patient, measuring expression of a woman who had decided exactly how much of herself this room was going to get. I sat beside her. Richard cleared his throat. "I'm glad we could all come together like adults," he said, with the tone of a man who considers himself the most reasonable person in any room he enters. "I think if we approach this calmly, we can find a resolution that works for everyone." "I agree," I said pleasantly. "Let's be calm." Ryan uncrossed his arms. He reached into the leather bag beside him and pulled out a manila folder and dropped it on the coffee table between us with a sound that was clearly intended to be definitive. "3 personal guarantee agreements," he said, "signed by Walter Hayes, witnessed and notarized." He looked at me with the flat confidence of a man who had been rehearsing this moment. "Northbridge Holdings releases the frozen credit facilities by end of business Friday. Madeline comes home today, and we don't file these with the bank or the federal tax authority. That's the offer. It doesn't get better." I looked at the folder without touching it. "May I ask?" I said, "Who else will be joining us this morning?" Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Nobody's joining anything. This is a family conversation." I checked my watch. That's interesting because Samuel mentioned he'd be bringing a few colleagues. As if on cue, and it was in fact on cue because Samuel Grant had spent 30 years practicing the art of the perfectly timed entrance, the front door opened behind us and footsteps crossed the entrance hall. Samuel came in first, briefcase in hand, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who had been the most prepared person in difficult rooms for 3 decades. Behind him came Daniel Crowe, Then 2 representatives from Columbus First Federal Bank in their bank-issued lanyards, and finally a compact, silver-haired man in his late 50s whom I had not yet introduced to anyone in this room. "Who are these people?" Victoria said sharply. Samuel set his briefcase on the side table and opened it without looking at her. "Representatives of the senior lender," he said. Richard stood up. "Northbridge sent lawyers." "We don't need lawyers in here. We just need to have a straightforward conversation about—" "You already are," Samuel said. Richard stopped. Samuel turned toward me. "Mr. Hayes, all documentation is ready." Ryan looked at me, then at Samuel, then back at me, and I watched the first hairline crack appear in his composure. Just a flicker, a millisecond of recalculation behind his eyes, there and gone. "Hayes," he said. "His name is Walter." "Yes," Samuel said. "Walter Hayes, founder, chairman, and sole owner of Northbridge Holdings, the private investment trust currently holding the senior lender position on all active Caldwell development credit facilities." The room did not go quiet so much as it stopped. Richard sat back down. Not deliberately, his legs simply made the decision for him, the way legs do when the ground shifts unexpectedly beneath a person. The color in his face moved through several changes in the space of 2 seconds, landing finally on something pale and recalculating. Victoria said, "That is not possible." "Northbridge has financed 3 of your largest projects over 8 years, I said. "The hotel development Richard described at dinner 4 nights ago was pending Northbridge approval. It will remain pending indefinitely." I looked at Richard. "The patient money he mentioned at dinner. That was me." Richard's mouth opened, closed. He looked at me, really looked at me, possibly for the first time, and I could see him retracing every dinner, every casual dismissal, every moment he had glanced at my truck in the driveway and formed a conclusion. Ryan slammed his bourbon glass down on the side table hard enough to slosh the contents over the rim. "This is a setup," he said, his voice rising. "You planned this entire—" "The documents," Samuel said calmly, nodding toward the silver-haired man he had brought with him. "Mr. Hollis." James Hollis had spent 22 years as a question documents examiner for the FBI before opening his private practice in Columbus. He set a thin report on the coffee table beside Ryan's manila folder, opened it to the first page, and spoke in the measured voice of a man who had testified in federal court more times than he could count. "The 3 signatures on the guarantee documents in that folder are digital forgeries," he said. "They were generated from samples of Mr. Hayes's handwriting, collected from personal correspondence, greeting cards, handwritten letters, personal checks over a period of approximately 14 months. The forgery technique is sophisticated but identifiable under spectral analysis. I have examined the originals, and I am prepared to testify to these findings in federal court." Ryan took 1 step toward Hollis. "That's a lie," he said, and his voice had cracked somewhere in the middle of the sentence, gone ragged at the edges, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked exactly like what he was. A 32-year-old man watching the structure he had built collapse around him with nothing underneath to catch his fall. "Ryan." Samuel's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Sit down." Ryan did not sit down, but he stopped moving, which was enough for now. Madeline had not spoken since we entered the room. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched her husband's face fall apart piece by piece, and I could not read what was in her expression. Not satisfaction, not grief, not anger exactly. Something more complex and more final than any of those. The expression of a woman who is watching the last version of a story she had told herself for 4 years finally reveal itself as something else entirely. "Daniel," I said. Daniel Crow opened his laptop. Daniel did not use many words. He had learned in 15 years of federal financial investigation that numbers were more devastating than language when they were arranged correctly. And he arranged them correctly, now projecting the first spreadsheet onto the wall-mounted screen that Richard used for business presentations, which struck me as an appropriate surface for what was about to be shown on it. Caldwell Development's reported portfolio value, Daniel said, versus independently verified recoverable value. 2 columns. The gap between them was $33 million. The difference represents inflated asset valuations properties pledged as collateral to multiple lenders simultaneously, which constitutes bank fraud under Title 18, Section 1344, and income routed through vendor payments to entities that do not exist as operating businesses. Richard stared at the screen. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, had moved without his appearing to notice, both of them gripping the arms of the wingback chair, now knuckles showing white through the skin. "Those figures are taken out of context," he said, but his voice had lost its boardroom certainty, entirely gone thin and unconvincing, the voice of a man reading from a script he no longer believed in. "The context is in the appendix," Daniel said, and moved to the next slide. Ryan's personal account transfers filled the screen. $1,200,000 itemized across 22 months. Online gambling platforms, cryptocurrency exchanges, a shell company holding a lease on a Columbus condominium. Daniel read through the categories without inflection, the way a doctor reads a diagnosis, not to wound, simply to inform. Victoria made a sound beside Richard. Not words, just a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, the sound of a woman who had believed she understood the full extent of her family's situation and has just discovered she did not. "Ryan." Her voice came out stripped of everything, the dinner party smoothness, the social precision, all of it gone. Just a mother saying her son's name in a room where his choices were being displayed on a screen. "Ryan, what is this?" Ryan set his bourbon glass down very carefully, like he was moving in slow motion. His jaw was set hard, and his eyes were moving rapidly between the screen and his father and back again, and I could see him running calculations, looking for an exit, finding none. "This is a manufactured attack," he said. "These numbers have been manipulated." "By whom?" Daniel asked. Ryan had no answer for that. Daniel moved to the final slide. The wire transfer records. 46 transactions, each one documented with originating account, receiving account, date, and amount, each one crossing Title 18, Section 1343, Daniel said. 20 years per count. There are 46 counts. He closed the laptop and looked at me. "There's one more thing. This morning before we arrived, Ryan initiated 3 wire transfers out of the Caldwell Development operating accounts. The funds were moving toward an offshore routing number we haven't fully traced yet. Agent Simmons documented those transfers this morning that gave her the flight risk justification needed to proceed on an emergency criminal complaint rather than waiting for a grand jury indictment. The math in that room landed on everyone at the same time. Richard let go of the chair arms. He pressed both hands flat against his thighs and looked at me across the coffee table with the expression of a man who has just finished adding a very long column of numbers and arrived at a total he cannot afford. "Walter." His voice had changed completely. The campaign stop energy was gone. What was left was older and quieter and considerably more afraid. "Walter, you and we can work something out. Privately. You're practically family. Whatever the business difficulties are, we can—" "You watched your son raise his hand to my daughter," I said. "In your living room, in front of your guests, and then you sat back down and picked up your fork." Richard closed his mouth. "Tell me what you would like to work out," I said. "Take your time." He had nothing. Ryan pushed himself to his feet. His chair scraped back hard against the hardwood, and he was moving toward the entrance hall before anyone had processed that he was leaving his jacket in his hand, his car keys already out. "Ryan," Samuel said. Ryan didn't stop. He made it to the entrance hall. He reached for the front door handle. The door opened from the outside. Agent Carol Simmons stepped through it, and behind her, her partner, both of them in dark coats with their credentials already displayed, moving with the calm, unhurried authority of people who are exactly where they plan to be. "Ryan Caldwell." Agent Simmons's voice was level and clear. "FBI. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and bank fraud under federal statute. You have the right to remain silent." Ryan took one step backward. His car keys hit the floor. Agent Simmons continued reading him his rights in the same even voice, and her partner moved to Ryan's left, and the whole thing happened with a procedural quietness that was somehow more final than noise would have been. Ryan did not fight. He did not speak. He stood in the entrance hall of his parents' house with his keys on the floor and his jacket still in his hand, and listened to the rights he was entitled to, with the expression of a man hearing a language he had always assumed would never be directed at him. I turned back to the living room. Victoria was on her feet, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, her face the color of old paper. "This cannot be happening," she said to no one in particular, to the room, to the situation itself. "This is our home. This is our family. You cannot, Mrs. Caldwell." Samuel's voice was not unkind. "Please sit down." She sat. The composure she had maintained for 61 years through every dinner party and charity auction and family crisis cracked across the surface like old glaze on a piece of furniture that had been refinished too many times. Underneath it was just a woman who had spent decades building something that was not as solid as she had believed, and who was only now in this room beginning to understand the difference between the appearance of permanence and the real thing. Madeline stood up. She had not moved since we entered the room, had sat through Daniel's presentation and James Hollis's testimony, and Ryan's unraveling with the stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular moment and is not going to waste it by rushing. She walked to the entrance hall doorway and stood there looking at Ryan. He looked back at her. His eyes were red at the rims now, and something in his face had broken open that I did not think he had intended to show anyone, least of all her. "Madeline," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had, smaller and too late. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I hope it was worth it, Ryan." She turned away from him and came back to stand beside me, and she slipped her hand into the crook of my arm the way she had when she was small, and the world had presented her with something larger than she knew how to hold alone. I put my hand over hers. Behind us, Agent Simmons's partner was guiding Ryan toward the door, and the last sound Ryan Caldwell made in his parents' house was the quiet, definitive click of handcuffs closing. "Walter." Samuel appeared at my elbow, his briefcase already closed. "Richard is ready to discuss cooperation terms." I looked across the room at Richard Caldwell, the man who had spent 8 years borrowing my money and 4 years dismissing me at his dinner table, and 4 nights ago sat in his chair while his son struck my daughter and did not stand up. "Give him a moment," I said. "Let him sit with it." Samuel nodded and said nothing more, and the room settled into the particular quiet of a thing that has been a long time coming and has finally arrived. The front door closed behind Agent Simmons and the room exhaled, not with relief, with the particular heaviness that settles over a space after something irreversible has happened inside it. Richard was still in his wingback chair, both hands pressed flat against his thighs, staring at a point on the carpet between his feet. Victoria had her arms wrapped around herself on the sofa, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a woman trying to locate the version of this morning she had planned, and finding it entirely gone. Vanessa was on her feet. She had been sitting beside the window since we arrived, quiet, and still performing invisibility with the practiced skill of someone who had been doing it for 14 months. But Ryan's arrest had broken something in her. I could see it in the way she was standing. Weight shifting from foot to foot, fingers working against each other, her composure coming apart in small, rapid increments, like a seam pulling loose under pressure. She looked at Madeline. "Maddie!" Her voice came out high and unsteady, cracking on the second syllable. "Maddie, I need you to understand. It wasn't supposed to go this far. When Ryan first approached me, I didn't know what he was planning. I thought—" "Vanessa." Madeline's voice was quiet and completely level. "Don't. I need you to hear me." Vanessa took a step forward, her eyes filling fast, her hands coming up in the helpless gesture of someone who has run out of everything except the need to be understood. "You're my best friend. You have been since we were 19 years old. I made a terrible mistake, and I know that, but Ryan told me the marriage was already over, that you two had been done for years, that he just needed time to—" "He told you it was over," Madeline said. "So you helped him collect my father's signature samples. So you sat in my living room and held my hand and came to my doctor's appointments, and all that time you were feeding him information about my family." She looked at Vanessa with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but something that combined elements of both into something harder and more permanent than either. "How long before you told him about my father's routines when the shop opened, when he left for errands, which neighbors watched the house?" Vanessa's tears broke free. They ran down her face in 2 fast lines, and she pressed her fingers against her mouth and made a sound that was somewhere between a "s" and an apology. The kind of sound that has no dignity left in it and no longer cares. "I didn't know they were going to threaten you," she said. "I swear to God I didn't know about the documents until after 8 months." The voice came from the sofa. Everyone turned. Victoria had unfolded her arms. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, her eyes no longer fixed on the middle distance but on Vanessa, and her expression had shifted into something I had not seen on her face before. Not the polished social cruelty of the dinner table, not the performance of authority. Just a woman who was tired and old and had run out of architecture to hide behind. "I knew about the two of them 8 months ago," Victoria said. Her voice was flat and stripped of every layer she had spent decades building over it. "Ryan came to me. He said he wanted to end the marriage. I told him he could not." She paused, and in that pause I could hear the specific sound of a person choosing finally to stop managing. The company was already in difficulty. A divorce would have created scrutiny we could not afford. Journalists, financial analysts, questions about the asset valuations. Another pause. "I told Ryan that if he ended the marriage before the company's position stabilized, I would tell Richard everything about Vanessa." Ryan understood what that meant. The room absorbed this. Madeline turned slowly and looked at her mother-in-law. "You knew he was doing this to me," she said. "The control, the threats. You knew what was happening inside my marriage, and you used it to keep your company afloat." Victoria met her gaze and did not look away, which I gave her some credit for. "I told myself it was temporary," she said. "That once the finances were resolved—" "How long is temporary?" Madeline's voice cracked on the last word, not with tears, but with something that burned hotter than tears, a fury so compressed it had become almost quiet. "How many dinners, how many times did you sit across from me and smile and call me sweetheart while you knew what your son was doing?" Her chin was trembling now, and she was fighting it with everything she had, jaw tight, shoulders squared, every muscle in her body, working against the grief, trying to break through. You hit me in front of 50 people, and then you watched him do worse in private. And you said nothing because the company needed another quarter. Victoria's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, just a single crack across the surface visible in the way her throat moved, and her eyes filled, and her hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles went white. "I know," she said, and her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I know what I did." "Mrs. Caldwell." Samuel appeared in the doorway, his voice professional and careful. "I'd strongly recommend you speak with an attorney before you say anything further." Victoria looked at him, then back at Madeline. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap and said nothing more. Vanessa had sunk back into her chair, both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that has no performance in it, the raw, ugly kind that comes when you have finally run out of ways to manage what you have done. Madeline turned away from both of them and came back to where I was standing near the doorway. She pressed her forehead briefly against my shoulder 1 second, maybe 2, and I put my hand on the back of her head, the way I had when she was small, and the world had been too large, and felt the fine trembling running through her that she was not going to let anyone else see. "I've got you," I said. She straightened. She pulled in one long breath and let it out slowly, and when she lifted her head, her face was composed again, not the careful, managed composure of someone performing strength, but the real kind, earned. Agent Simmons appeared behind Samuel. "Mr. Caldwell." She looked at Richard. "When you're ready." Richard looked up from the carpet, looked at me, and something in his face shifted, not remorse exactly, but the recognition of a man who has been living inside a set of assumptions that have just been entirely dismantled. "I'll cooperate," he said. "Full cooperation, whatever you need." Across the room, Vanessa lowered her hands from her face, mascara tracked in 2 dark lines down her cheeks, and looked at Madeline with the expression of someone who has destroyed something irreplaceable and is only now understanding its full value. "Maddie," she said. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't—" "No," Madeline said quietly. "It doesn't." She held Vanessa's gaze long enough that Vanessa had to carry the full weight of it. "But I heard you say it." She turned away and did not look back. We walked out through the entrance hall, past Ryan's car keys still lying on the floor where they had fallen, and through the front door into the cold December morning. The gravel crunched under our feet. The sky was white and flat and completely still. "Okay," Madeline said when we reached the truck. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. The trembling was gone. "Okay." It was not a word that meant everything was fine. It was a word that meant she was still standing. And for right now, that was enough. Samuel arrived at 4 in the afternoon. I heard his car in the driveway, the quiet, unhurried sound of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove, and went to let him in before he knocked. He came through the door with his briefcase and his coat, and the particular calm that he carried into every room as a matter of professional practice, and he stopped in the entrance hall and looked at me the way he occasionally did, with a directness that had nothing performative about it. "How is she?" he asked. "Better than yesterday," I said. "Worse than she's letting on." He nodded, accepting both things as simultaneously true, which they were. Madeline was in the kitchen. She had spent most of the day in the woodshop beside me, not working, just sitting on the stool near the window with a mug gone cold in her hands, and her eyes somewhere far away, and somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, she had stood up without a word and gone inside and started making soup from scratch. That told me everything. It was what her mother had always done when the harder work was happening underneath. Keep the hands busy, let the rest catch up. The kitchen smelled of onions and thyme. Madeline turned when she heard us, and her eyes went straight to Samuel's briefcase with an expression that was ready and a little tired and entirely clear. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get coffee." She poured 3 cups without being asked, set them on the table, and took her place across from Samuel. She folded her hands and waited with the patience of someone who has already decided they can handle whatever comes next. Samuel opened his briefcase. "I'll go through this methodically," he said. "Stop me if you have questions." He began with Ryan. Ryan Caldwell has been charged with wire fraud under Title 18, Section 1343-46 counts. Forgery of financial instruments, Section 513 3 counts. Bank fraud, Section 1344-7 counts. Domestic violence under Ohio Revised Code, Section 29, 19.25. He turned a page. He has declined to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Based on the strength of the documentation, the U.S. Attorney's Office is pursuing a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. That is not a negotiating position. That is what the evidence supports. Madeline received this without visible reaction. She picked up her coffee cup, held it in both hands, and looked at Samuel steadily without blinking. "Richard," Samuel continued, "has entered into a full cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. In exchange for his testimony and the surrender of all relevant documentation, the government is recommending a sentence of 4 years at a minimum security federal facility. His attorneys accepted those terms this morning." "And Victoria?" Madeline asked. "Victoria Caldwell is a compelled witness. She will be required to testify to what she knew and when she knew it. She is not facing criminal charges at this time, though that assessment may change." Samuel paused. "Her attorneys have advised her to cooperate fully." Madeline nodded once. "Vanessa. Vanessa Blake has entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution. She will serve as a primary witness in both the forgery and wire fraud proceedings." He looked at Madeline carefully. "She will be required to testify in detail, in open court." Something moved across Madeline's face, not satisfaction, not sympathy, something more complicated than either. She looked down at her coffee and then back up. "What about the property?" "The Caldwell estate has been placed under civil asset forfeiture, pursuant to Title 18, Section 981, effective this morning pursuant to a federal seizure order filed yesterday afternoon. Physical assets are frozen, no transfers, no sales. Formal transfer to federal custody takes 4 to 6 months." He set a folded document on the table. "Effective immediately, the Caldwells have no access to the property." Then he reached back into the briefcase and removed a white envelope with Madeline's name on the front in his precise handwriting. He placed it in front of her without ceremony. She looked at it. "What is this?" "2 documents," Samuel said. "The first is a petition for dissolution of marriage on fault grounds under Ohio law, citing adultery and extreme cruelty. Ohio Revised Code, Section 31, 07.05. The second is a civil protection order under Ohio Revised Code, Section 31, 13.31. It prohibits Ryan Caldwell from contacting you, approaching within 500 feet of your person or residence, or communicating through any third party. Effective immediately." Madeline picked up the envelope. She turned it over once, set it down, and pressed her palms flat against the table on either side of it, steadying herself without appearing to. "You had this ready," she said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "Your father asked me to prepare it 3 days ago," Samuel said. "The morning after Christmas." She looked at me. I looked back and said nothing, because there was nothing to explain. She already knew. She had always known the things about me that I thought I was concealing in the way that daughters always do. She opened the envelope deliberately, without rushing. She read through both documents with the focused attention of someone accepting the legal reality of the end of something they had once believed in completely. When she finished, she picked up her pen and signed her name at the bottom of the divorce petition, in a hand that did not shake at all, and pushed it back across to Samuel. He gathered the papers, closed his briefcase with two small, precise sounds, and stood. He shook my hand. Then he turned to Madeline and shook hers, not the handshake of a lawyer concluding business, but the handshake of someone who meant what the gesture implied. "It's going to take time," he said, "but the hardest part is done." Madeline looked up at him. "Which part is the hardest part?" Samuel considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "The part where you didn't know what was real," he said. I walked him to the door. When I came back, Madeline was still at the table, coffee cold in front of her, soup simmering on the stove. The low sideways December light coming through the window, the way it does in Ohio when the day has almost finished, deciding to end. She looked up when I sat down. "Dad," she said, "I don't actually know very much about you, do I?" Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of someone who has been reading a familiar map and has just noticed a road that was always there and never marked. "No," I said, "not yet." Something in her expression loosened. Not anger, not grief, but something that felt carefully, and for the first time like curiosity. "Then tell me," she said. The soup was still on the stove. Outside, the December light was going. I started talking. I told her everything. Not the way I had told Samuel things over the years in precise, documented, legally structured terms, but the way you tell things to someone who deserves the full version, which is to say imperfectly and in order, and without knowing exactly where the weight is going to fall until it has already landed. I told her about the structural engineering work, the years of commercial projects across Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, the particular combination of timing and discipline that had turned a good income into something larger than I had originally intended. I told her how Northbridge had begun not as a grand design, but as a practical necessity, a structure to hold assets that had grown beyond what a personal account could reasonably manage. I told her about Samuel and the two CPAs, who were the only people outside of this kitchen who knew the complete picture. Madeline listened, the way she had always listened, completely, without interrupting, her coffee going cold in front of her, and her eyes on my face reading something in it that went beyond the words. When I stopped, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much, Val?" I told her the number. She looked at me for a long time after that. The soup was still simmering on the stove, and the kitchen clock moved its hands with the indifference clocks have toward the things that happen beneath them, and outside the window, the last of the December light had gone entirely. "You drove a 15-year-old truck," she said. "It runs fine." "Dad, the truck has never once let me down," I said. "Which is more than I can say for most things that cost more." A sound came out of her, something between exasperation and laughter, not quite either one. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and when she looked back down, her eyes were bright, but not with tears. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to know that first. Whatever else I feel angry is not the word." What is the word? She thought about it the way she always thought about things, slowly, honestly. "Disoriented," she said. "Like I've been reading a map that was accurate in most ways but missing one road, a significant road. And now I'm looking at the map again and understanding why certain trips took longer than they needed to." "That's fair. You were protecting me," she said. "Mom asked you to, and you did it exactly the way she would have approved of, and then you held on to it past the point where protection was what it was doing." She tilted her head. At some point it became about you, didn't it? Not about me. The accuracy of it landed without softening. Yes, I said. At some point it did. You got comfortable being invisible. I did. And then invisible became a habit. Yes. She nodded slowly, accepting this not as an excuse but as an explanation, which were different things, and she knew the difference. Ryan would have been different if he had known, she said. But Dad, I also might have been different. More guarded. More suspicious. I might have gone through my 20s holding everyone at arm's length, because I could never be sure whether they were real or after something. That's what your mother was afraid of. I know. She looked at her hands. She was right and you were right, and it still cost me 4 years and a marriage that was never a marriage. She looked up. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying that being right doesn't mean nothing was lost. No, I said. It doesn't. We sat with that, the truth of it, the complexity of it, the way that good intentions and real love can still produce outcomes that hurt. It was not comfortable. But it was honest, and honesty was what this kitchen had been built for. Tell me about the company, Madeline said. Not the legal structure, the actual thing. What does it feel like to have built something that large and have almost nobody know it exists? The question surprised me, which she could tell, and she smiled, a real one, the first in 4 days that reached all the way to her eyes. Lonely sometimes, I said, and then sometimes not. There's a particular satisfaction in knowing that something you've built is standing quietly, doing what you made it to do without needing anyone to acknowledge it. Like a good piece of furniture. Exactly like that. She reached across and put her hand over mine, warm, now the trembling entirely gone, steady, the way it had been when she was 4 years old at the Saturday farmer's market in Gahanna, her small fingers wrapped around exactly 2 of mine. Stop pretending to be smaller than you are, she said. It doesn't suit you. She stood and went to the stove and stirred the soup, and I sat in the kitchen where she had grown up and listened to the spoon against the pot and the furnace cycling on and the old house settling in the cold. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than relief. The particular peace of a man who has finally said the true thing to the right person and found that the world did not end and that the person is still there. I found it on a Thursday morning. I had been working through the old safe in the back of my study since 7, pulling out documents I no longer needed and sorting them into 2 piles, keep and shred, with the methodical patience of a man who has accepted that moving means making decisions about things he has been not deciding for years. Tax records, deed copies, insurance policies from the previous decade, a folded map of Columbus from 1987 that I could not explain, but could not bring myself to throw away. The safe was deeper than I usually reached. At the back, behind a manila folder containing the original Northbridge Incorporation documents, my hand found an envelope. White, standard size. Slightly thicker than a single sheet of paper. My name was not on it. Madeline's was. The handwriting was Helen's. I would have known it in the dark. Would have known it on the other side of the world, the particular slant of her capital M, and the way she always pressed slightly harder on the downstrokes. And in the lower left corner in the same hand, 7 words that hit me like a fist closing around my heart. Open when you find yourself enduring not loving. I sat down in the chair beside the safe. I don't know how long I sat there. Helen had always understood that timing was everything. She had not left the letter for Madeline to find on her own. She had left it for me to give at the moment I finally had the sense to look. Long enough for the morning light through the study window to shift a degree or 2. Long enough to understand several things in sequence, that Helen had written this letter and sealed it and placed it here herself, that she had done so without telling me, and that she had known in the way she always knew that there would come a day when Madeline would need something from her mother that I would not be able to provide. I turned the envelope over once in my hands. I did not open it. It was not mine to open. I found Madeline in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her laptop open, doing research for a housing nonprofit she had been in contact with. She looked up when I came in and read my face the way she had always been able to read my face despite my best efforts to the contrary. "What happened?" she asked. I sat down across from her and placed the envelope on the table between us. She looked at the handwriting. Her breath left her in a single quiet exhalation, like something had pressed gently against her chest from the inside. "Is that—" "Yes." She reached out and touched the envelope with her fingertips, not picking it up yet, just touching it. Her eyes filled immediately, the way eyes do when they are not expecting to feel something, and feel it anyway, sudden and total, no warning. "She wrote this before she died," Madeline said. "That's my understanding. And you never knew it was there?" "No." She picked it up. She held it with both hands and looked at her name in her mother's writing, and the tears that had filled her eyes spilled over, and she didn't bother to wipe them. Just let them fall the way they needed to. "I'll be in the shop," I said. She looked up at me, and in her expression I saw something that undid me completely. Not grief, or not only grief, but gratitude. The particular gratitude of someone who has just been given something they did not know they needed and cannot yet fully name. "Thank you," she said. I nodded. I stood and walked down the hall and through the back door and across the frozen yard to the wood shop. I closed the door behind me and stood in the cold quiet of the shop, with the smell of sawdust and linseed oil around me and my hands at my sides. I did not pick up a tool. I just stood there and let my daughter have her mother back for a little while. Through the walls of the shop, I could not hear anything. The house was too far, the shop walls too thick. But at some point, I could not say how much later, I heard the back door open and footsteps cross the frozen yard. Madeline came in. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she had the envelope in her hand open now, the letter folded back inside it. She did not try to describe what was in it. I did not ask. She crossed the shop and stood beside me at the workbench and looked at the grain of the wood, the way I had taught her to look at things when she was small, patiently, without rushing toward a conclusion. After a while, she said, "She knew." "Yes." "She knew, and she wrote it down, and she put it somewhere she trusted you to find." My throat was too tight to speak, so I just nodded. Madeline pressed the envelope against her chest with one hand, and with the other she reached out and took hold of my arm, not dramatically, just a steady grip, the grip of someone making sure you know they are there. "She trusted you," Madeline said, "even with the things she couldn't tell you directly. She trusted you to be in the right place at the right time." She looked at me. "She was right, Dad. You were." I pressed my hand over hers on my arm and held it there. Outside, the last day of December was doing what December days do in Ohio, gray and cold, and completely indifferent to everything beneath it. But in the shop it was warm, and it smelled of wood and oil, and the accumulated hours of 30 years of quiet work, and my daughter was standing beside me with her mother's letter against her heart. "Thank you for not reading it," she said. "It was yours," I said. "It was always yours." She nodded once and tucked the envelope carefully into the pocket of her sweatshirt. Then she looked around the shop at the tools on their hooks, the half-finished cabinet door on the bench, the window with its view of the frozen yard, and something in her expression shifted quietly and completely from grief into something that was not yet peace but was pointed in that direction. "When do we move?" she asked. The workbench was the last thing. I had built it into the wall 23 years ago, with lag bolts and intention, and it had stayed exactly where I put it through 3 decades of winters and 1 marriage and the raising of a daughter and more board feet of lumber than I had ever bothered to count. It was too heavy to move and too embedded to extract without damaging the wall, and so I had made my peace with leaving it, which was the right decision and still cost me something. I stood in the empty shop on the last morning of that year and put both hands flat on the surface of the bench and looked at the grain of the old oak under my palms. Almost a year, which for a federal case of this complexity was unusually fast. The U.S. attorney had moved quickly, citing the strength of the documented evidence and Ryan's continued refusal to engage with cooperation offers. The judge had agreed. Ryan had been sentenced in October, 12 years in federal prison, no early release recommendation, the result of declining to cooperate with prosecutors on any of the 46 wire fraud counts or the forgery charges. His attorney had called it excessive. The federal judge had called it proportionate and moved on to the next case. Richard had received his 4 years in September with full cooperation, credit applied. He had looked smaller in the courtroom than he had ever looked at his own dinner table, which I supposed was the natural result of being in a room where reputation carried no weight and documentation carried everything. The Caldwell estate had been formally transferred to federal custody in June, 6 months after the asset freeze. I had read the notice in a 2-paragraph item buried in the Columbus business section. Victoria had left Ohio sometime before that Cincinnati someone said a cousin's house. The donor wall at the Columbus Museum of Art still had the Caldwell name on it, which struck me as the kind of detail that outlasts its meaning by several years. Vanessa had testified at both trials. Her cooperation agreement had held. She had moved to Cleveland afterward, according to Daniel, and was working in a position that had nothing to do with anyone she had known before. I did not know whether to call that justice or simply consequence, and I had stopped needing to decide. Madeline had not accepted a single dollar from me. She had found a small apartment 2 miles from the shop, paid the first month's rent herself from savings she had quietly accumulated during the marriage, in an account Ryan had not known about a detail that told me my daughter had been preparing for the possibility of leaving long before she found the courage to do it. She had started at the Domestic Violence Resource Center in November in the intake coordinator position, the lowest rung, the one that required the most patience and offered the least recognition. She had not complained once. The Helen Hayes Fund had been established in August, a private charitable foundation providing legal and financial support to survivors of domestic abuse in central Ohio. Madeline had not asked me to name it after her mother. I had made that decision alone, and when I told her, she had pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and then said, very quietly, she would have hated the attention, and then she would have loved the work. Both things were true. I lifted my hands from the workbench and looked at the impression they had left in the fine layer of sawdust on the surface, 2 handprints side by side, already beginning to blur at the edges. The door opened behind me. Madeline came in wearing her work coat, her hair pulled back, a travel mug in each hand. She had been here since 7, helping load the truck, and she moved through the empty shop with the ease of someone who had spent enough time in it to know its dimensions without measuring. She held out one of the mugs. I took it. "Ready?" she asked. I looked around the shop one last time. The hooks where the hand planes had hung for 20 years. The chalk lines on the floor where the table saw had stood. The window above the bench where the morning light came through at an angle I had learned to work by, had learned to read grain by, had spent 30 years being taught by without fully realizing I was being taught. "No," I said, "but we're going anyway." She smiled at that, the full version, the one with her mother's warmth in it. We walked out together, and I pulled the door shut behind me and did not look back at it. The truck was waiting in the driveway, loaded and ready, and beyond it, the neighborhood looked the way neighborhoods do on winter mornings, still and ordinary, and completely unbothered by the things that had happened inside the houses along its streets. Madeline climbed into the passenger seat, and I climbed into the driver's side and started the engine, and the old truck turned over on the first try, the way it always did, steady and reliable, and entirely indifferent to how much things cost. 40 minutes, Madeline said, looking out the windshield at the road ahead. 40 minutes, I agreed. I pulled out of the driveway and pointed us east toward Granville, toward the barn with good bones and east-facing windows and 30 years of quiet work waiting to begin again. Granville arrived the way small towns do when you come from the city gradually, then all at once. The roads narrowed. The trees grew closer to the shoulders. The gas stations and strip malls fell away and were replaced by fenced fields and bare-limbed oaks, and the particular quality of winter air that has not been processed by anything cold and clean, and carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere out of sight. Madeline had her elbow on the window ledge and was watching the countryside pass with an expression I had not seen on her face in years. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. The expression of a person who has been indoors for a very long time and has just stepped outside and remembered what outside felt like. The barn sat at the end of a gravel lane off the county road, a 2-story structure of heavy timber framing and thick plank walls with a bank of east-facing windows along the upper level that caught the winter light and held it differently than any window I had seen in the city. I had bought the property 8 months ago on an afternoon drive with no particular destination, had stood in the empty space inside and known immediately the way you know with good wood, not because it was perfect, but because the bones were right and the rest was work. We spent the morning unloading. Madeline carried things with the careful, unhurried competence of someone who had been watching how to do this for 28 years without being formally taught. She wrapped the hand planes in shop rags the right way, nested the chisels point down in their roll, set the cabinet doors against the wall in the sequence they would need to be hung. I did not comment on any of it. Some things are better received without attention drawn to them. By early afternoon, the tools were on their hooks, and the lumber was stacked, and the shop had the beginning of an order to it, not finished, not settled, but oriented, pointed in the right direction. Madeline found a nail and a hammer, and hung the photograph of Helen on the east wall above the workbench, where the morning light would find it first. She stood back and looked at it for a moment, with her hands in her coat pockets, and her head tilted slightly, and I stayed where I was and let her have the moment without filling it. Then she went to the truck and came back with the wooden box. Victoria had thrown it in the trash the night of the Christmas party. Madeline had gone back for it the morning after. In the narrow window before the federal seal was placed on the property, had driven to the Caldwell house alone and knocked on the service entrance and asked the housekeeper if she could retrieve one item from the waste bin, and the housekeeper had looked at her face and said yes, without asking why. The brass latch was slightly bent. There was a crack along the lower left corner, where it had hit the bottom of the bin. Madeline had asked me once if I could repair it, and I had told her I could make it look like it never happened, and she had said she didn't want that. She set it on the shelf below Helen's photograph. The crack was visible. The latch was bent. The walnut still had its color and its grain, and the careful joinery at the corners that I had spent 3 weeks on, because I wanted it to be right. It was both damaged and exactly what it had always been, which seemed like the right condition for it. Pastor Whitaker arrived at 2 without calling ahead. He came through the shop door in his winter coat, looked around at the space with the quiet attention of a man who understood the value of things built to last, and said simply, "Good bones." "That's what I thought," I said. He walked the perimeter of the shop, slowly touching the timber framing here and there, looking up at the loft windows and the way the light came through them. He did not offer a formal blessing or produce anything from his coat. He just stood in the center of the space for a moment, with his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly. And then he opened his eyes and shook my hand and shook Madeline's hand and said, "Helen would have liked this place." Madeline's eyes filled, but she was smiling when they did. "Yes," she said, "she would have." He left at 2:30 the same way he had arrived, quietly, without ceremony, the way people move through the world when they have nothing to prove. Peggy arrived 20 minutes later with a tin of butter cookies she had baked that morning. She hugged Madeline for a long time, the unself-conscious hug of a woman who had known her since she was 12 years old, and felt no need to explain it. Then she looked around the shop and said, "It smells like Walter in here already," which made Madeline laugh, a full, genuine laugh, the kind that surprised her while it was happening. Peggy stayed for an hour and talked about nothing consequential, which was exactly what the afternoon needed. When she left, the shop was quiet again. The stove in the corner had warmed the space thoroughly. The light through the east windows had gone gold and low. Somewhere outside, the first flakes of what looked like serious snow were beginning to fall, drifting past the glass, with the unhurried certainty of something that had decided where it was going and was in no rush to get there. Madeline stood at the workbench, looking at the wide walnut board I had carried in last, 30 inches wide, straight grain, no knots, the kind of piece that comes through a shop once in a long while and waits. "What's that for?" she asked. I looked at the board and then at my daughter standing in the new shop with sawdust already on her coat and her mother's photograph on the wall behind her. "I don't know yet," I said. "I've been keeping it until I did." She looked at it for a long moment. "Maybe you know now," she said. "Teach me something," Madeline said. "Not a large request. Just the words of someone who is ready to begin and does not know exactly where beginning looks like, and so reaches for the nearest true thing." I took the hand plane down from its hook, the old Bailey No. 4 that had belonged to my father, that I had learned on, and broken, and repaired, and learned on again. I turned it over once in my hands, feeling the weight of it settle into my palms, checking the set of the blade the way you check something you trust, but verify anyway. "Come here," I said. She stepped up to the workbench beside me, and I positioned her hands on the plane, left hand on the front knob, right hand on the rear handle, the way my father had positioned mine 40 years ago in a shop that smelled exactly like this one. "Put your hands flat on the wood first," I said, "before anything else." She set the plane down and pressed both palms against the surface of the walnut board. The grain ran long and straight beneath her hands, warm-colored even in the winter light, the kind of wood that has been waiting quietly and does not mind how long. "Feel that?" I said. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely feeling it, not performing attention, but actually paying it the way she had always done things when she decided they were worth doing. "Yes," she said. "I feel it. That's the grain. That's the direction the wood wants to go." I picked the plane back up and set it in her hands. "You go with it, not against it, with it." She set the blade to the wood and pushed. The first curl came up pale and clean over the iron, thin as paper. The color of cream and the smell of fresh walnut rose into the cold air of the shop, the way it always does, immediate and warm, and completely itself, the smell of something that has been waiting inside the wood all along and has only now been found. Madeline looked at the curl in her hand. She looked up at me. I nodded once. She set the plane again. The second stroke was steadier, the curl longer, and she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close to the sound of a person discovering that something difficult is also unexpectedly satisfying. Outside the east windows, the snow had begun in earnest, now falling in the particular straight-down way that means it has settled in for the night. The stove in the corner ticked and breathed. The shop was warm and smelled of walnut and linseed oil, and the specific quality of air that exists only in a place where things are made. Madeline paused and looked at the board. At the two clean strokes across its surface, the wood opened up and bright where the plane had passed. "What do we build first?" she asked. I looked at my daughter standing at the workbench with sawdust on her hands, and her mother's photograph on the wall behind her, and 30 years of quiet work in the tools around us, and the whole of whatever came next, spread out ahead like a board, with good grain running in the right direction. "Something that lasts," I said. She turned back to the wood. The third stroke was the best one yet. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and unhurried, covering the gravel lane and the frozen fields and the roof of the old barn in the particular silence of a December evening in Ohio that has decided to be still. Inside the shop, the plane moved. The wood opened. The smell of walnut rose and filled the warm air. And my daughter learned. This is one of those family stories, revenge, that I never planned to tell. I kept secrets with the best of intentions. I told myself I was protecting Madeline. The truth is, I was also protecting myself from a harder conversation. Do not do what I did. If you love someone, give them the full version of who you are. God gives us people to walk beside, not performances to maintain. This is my family drama, revenge. Not through anger, not through cruelty, but through patience, truth, and the quiet application of what was always mine to use. I did not destroy the Caldwell family. They built their own destruction brick by brick across years of choices. I simply stopped holding the structure up. My personal belief: real strength is not loud. It does not arrive in anger. It arrives on time with documentation and in a flannel shirt. If any part of this family story's revenge reminded you of someone in your own life, a daughter who needed someone to show up a truth that stayed hidden too long, a moment when silence cost more than speaking, I would be grateful if you left that thought in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel so you never miss what comes next, thank you for staying until the very last word. It means more than I can say. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and connection. If that is not the content you are looking for, no hard feelings at all. There is something out there made just for you. Go find it.